would like to welcome you to session number 8. It's the Wayfarers, and it's a conversation between Wade Davis and Broughton Coburn. This is being sponsored by Shambhala Publications, and also Mr. Davis's participation is being sponsored by the Consul General of Canada in Denver. So I would like to welcome the Consul General, Stéphane Lassard, from Denver, to just say a couple of words, and then we will get started. Stéphane. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Stéphane. I'm Consul General here. It's a true pleasure to see you all. Thank you for coming. Our consulate supports this festival. Our consulate believes in this festival. It provides an opportunity to witness and hear and see great artists, great writers. And I think you're in for a treat today with Wade Davis and Broughton. Wade received recently the highest honor in our country, the Order of Canada, for his work. It's a big deal, and if you know Wade and his work, you know why. If not, you're about to find out why he's such a special man. An ethnobotanist and ethnologist, world-renowned author, explorer, trying to bring to us, because we can't always go to these places that you and Broughton have been to, Wade. We can't always go to these faraway places, but you bring them to us, and you help us make sense of a changing world and how we as humans need to be aware and maybe adapt to, and maybe make things better in some cases. And that's a big, I call that a public service. So certainly a big treat for me of having read your books, going back to the very first one, The Serpent and the Rainbow, and several others after. And we're super pleased to welcome you, and nice to meet you, Broughton. I think we're all in for a treat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lassard. Thank you. And by the way, right after this session, both Broughton and Wade will be downstairs in the book signing area, just at the bottom of these stairs, to sign books. It will be very brief in this one because they have another session at 1:30. And by the way, if you're hungry after this, there's some food tents out in the front yard. One is from Rat's Barbecue, and weird name, and the other one is from the Jaipur restaurant here in Boulder. So, Broughton, if you please could take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Well, those of you who know Wade Davis, or even have heard him speak, are aware that he's a force of nature. He was the model, really, for the original TED Talks, and is something of an uber explorer, adventurer, author, and info entertainer, and scholar as well. And right now, he's a professor of anthropology at the University of British Columbia. He's also a National Geographic explorer in residence, if that's not an oxymoron. And he is the author of a number of books, 22 books. One of the most recent is Into the Silence, which won the Samuel Johnson Award. Another one is The Wayfinders, the topic nominally of this afternoon's discussion. We were talking earlier about a book that he wrote about a much beloved professor that we shared at the same college, professor of ethnobotany, Dr. Richard Evans Schultes, a book called One River, which takes place largely in Colombia. And so I'd like to launch into a talk, Wade, about your experiences. Let's say to pick a location, Colombia, and your book One River, and how did you get into it? How has it changed your lives? How has it maybe even changed the lives of other people?
Well, thanks, Brad. And first of all, when I saw the program, I noticed there was an asterisk beside my name in every entry, and at first I thought maybe that meant maybe he'll come, maybe he won't, or avoid him at all costs. But then when I saw that it was because of the sponsorship of my country, Steph and I was so touched by that. You know, it says so much about Canada. You know, Canada's a very, very special place. You know, we value the arts. You can't imagine a Canadian Prime Minister wrapping themselves in the flag. We didn't even have one until 1965. And then we fought about 1 or 3 maple leafs. The kind of the most perfect expression of our patriotism is a wonderful line of Francophone verse, Mon pays, ce n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver. My country is not a country, it's the winter. And it's indeed the way to the north that kind of hovers in our imagination and creates the essence of the national soul. And just before I kind of answer Brat's question about Colombia, there's a marvelous account when the great travel writer Jan Morris went to Vancouver, and she reported that in Vancouver you could drown in niceness. And what had happened is she had bumped into a Canadian in the street, and of course, what did the Canadian say? I'm sorry. And she didn't quite get it because she had hit him. And what Jan, not being Canadian, didn't understand is that the phrase "I'm sorry" in Canada is not an apology, it's a mantra. And it's really a way of saying, look, we live in this bloody country where you could turn the United States on its side, plunk it into Canada, still have 2,000 kilometers of Canada running to the north. For most of our history, there were more lakes than people. We live in a society of consilience and cooperation. You didn't want to whack me. I didn't want to be whacked by you. So you're actually saying, I'm sorry for the awkwardness of the moment. And that sort of sums up the essence of Canada. So, Stefan, I just wanted to thank you really sincerely for the kindness and the support. But it touches upon, you know, this idea of national identity and the power of books. I wrote a book called One River, which, as Broughton mentioned, was really a simple account of travel and a biography of our legendary professor. And it came out in 1996, and I wanted it to be available in Spanish for the Colombian market. So I basically gave the rights away to the Banco de la República, and they brought a small edition of 500 copies. But critically, it was translated by an incredible Colombian poet, the late Nicholas Sescuan. And the book came out 200 pages longer in Spanish in 2002, when not a decent word was being said about that wonderful country. And suddenly there was an 800-page love letter. And the book simply took off. And I had no idea about this until I returned years later. And on the beach, I found a hippie girl reading a frayed copy of an edition I didn't know about. I interviewed the defense minister. He had a perfect edition of a copy of another edition on his desk in his office in Bogota. And the book had just sort of become a kind of antidote to darkness and a map of dreams for 2 generations of young Colombians who couldn't travel. And one of the people that was moved by the book was Jose Alberto Vélez, who was the CEO of the biggest corporation in Colombia, one of the biggest. And they were having their 100th anniversary. So he decided rather than celebrate the company, they would do something for the country. And they paid for teams of writers and botanists to go to each of the 5 major regions of Colombia, which is geographically the most diverse nation on earth, to write a book on each one, beautiful illustrated books that wouldn't be sold but would be gifted to every school and library as sets in the country to send a message to a new generation of kids that their country wasn't a country of violence and drugs, but the richest biodiversity on the planet. And out of that, at the end of that, I said to Jose Alberto, well, now that we've done the country, why don't we do the rivers? So instantly he offered to support all my work, as he has since 2015, for a new book that's almost finished on the Rio Magdalena, which is the Mississippi of Colombia. And this book is really all about calling for the cleaning up of the Magdalena as a symbol of peace, but it's really it's a story of redemption and hope. And Colombia's become my passion, as it always was. You know, I went there for the first time when I was 14, and with a small group of school children who were 16 and 17 from Canada, and many of them were desperately homesick. I felt, by contrast, that I had finally found home. And I've only just recently been made an honorary Colombian citizen by President Santos, and now I'm working at the highest levels of government to try to send a message of the truth about Colombia. And, you know, this is so important for us to share. You know, 50 years of war, 7 million displaced, 250,000 dead, and at no time were there more than 130 combatants on all three sides of a fratricidal civil war, all of which occurred in a country of 48 million people. So Colombians were victims of the violence. 1 out of 4 were forced to flee their homes. Now, can you imagine if Canada had anti-drug policies and a pattern of drug consumption such that 77 million Americans were forced to flee their country? Well, that's what happened in Colombia. The fuel of the war was always cocaine. The last year before the Acuerdo in Havana, FARC, just one of the guerrilla groups, made $600 million from cocaine. So as I said to Broughton before, I could take the Boulder Boy Scout group, and if I had $600 million and could buy a lot of AK-47s, I could wreak havoc in the state of Colorado quite easily. So Colombians, most of whom have never seen cocaine, have been the victims of a war that's been created by all those who have used cocaine. So the blood of Colombians is on the hands of every cocaine user and every country that's prohibited the use, facilitated the market, but done nothing to curb the distribution of the drug. And yet despite all of Colombia's agonies, the country has maintained civil society and democracy, greened its cities, created millions of acres of national parks, sought more meaningful restitution with indigenous people than any nation state on earth, and paved the way for the greatest cultural, intellectual, technological, and scientific renaissance in the history of any country in the Americas, as 2 generations of young boys and girls sent abroad for their survival are coming home from Paris and London and LA and New York with skill sets in every conceivable endeavor. And so the world may be falling apart, but Colombia is falling together. Medellin in 1984 had a murder rate 4 times that of Beirut. Today it's ranked as the most beautiful city in the world to live in. Colombia, by the reference of the National Geographic, is the most desirable country for tourism in the world. So Colombia deserves our support, and it has not deserved its agonies.
Do you think, Wade, that we were both in Tibet this past summer, and we saw some of the environmental and developmental challenges that are happening in Tibet, the juggernaut of development, road construction, tunnels, bridges, and the marginalization of the Tibetan culture. Perhaps countries like Tibet are on something of a downward slope compared to Colombia. Do you think that some of these countries, I mean, we've been on the planet long enough, I suppose, that have you seen a cycle that happens, one of deprivation followed by redemption, that kind of thing? I mean, how much hope do we have for some of these countries?
Well, I always, something I learned very early. One of my favorite writers was Peter Matthewson, and he always said anyone who thinks they can change the world is both wrong and dangerous. And he had in mind people like Mao, Hitler, and Stalin, but what he was really saying is that, and it's what, of course, the Buddhists have always said, that evil exists in the universe. And, Lord Krishna was asked by a disciple how the obvious question which led to the heresies of Europe in the Middle Ages. If God's all-powerful, how does he or she allow evil to exist? And when Lord Krishna was asked why there was evil in the universe, he responded, to thicken the plot. In other words, evil is, as the first of the 4 noble truths says, all life is suffering, is just out there. And the minute that you think you're going to vanquish evil, you sort of set yourself up for disappointment, which can end in disillusionment and even bitterness. But if you realize you're never going to beat evil, but you simply have to decide, as my father always said, what side you're going to be on, then, like the pilgrim who is not concerned of the destination but the path, you simply walk the path of righteousness throughout your life. And that's why you can be like, honestly, like Broughton and I were mates at Harvard. I mean, he was my hero, incidentally. He was 2 years older than me, and he was doing these crazy things in the Himalaya that I couldn't even imagine, but I wanted to do. And so I've always looked up to Brought. And, but, you know, we both share, at this point, not an idealism that really hasn't been quelled by all the things that we've seen. And yes, you can go to Tibet, and you can see the almost psychotic way in which the Chinese government, not necessarily the Chinese people, is refusing to acknowledge the gift to humanity that the Buddhist tradition of Tibet represents. And you can get discouraged, but then you can go to a place like Colombia where, you know, in the 1970s, when I would say to friends of mine that I was going to go live with the Arahuacos or the Kogi in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, their parents would say, ¿Por qué quiere vivir con la gente sucia? Why do you want to live with the dirty people? Now, the last 5 Colombian presidents, as the first act of office, even before their inauguration, has been to fly to those mamos, those priests, and seek their blessing, because the Arahuacos and the Kogi, the elder brothers, have emerged as a sort of symbol of continuity in a country that's had such difficulties. In 1986, President Virgilio Barco said to a young anthropologist, Martin van Hildebrand, Martin, do something for the Indians, as he put it. And in 5 incredible years as head of Indian Affairs, Martin did more than something. He secured legal title to lands collectively the size of the United Kingdom for the 57 ethnicities of the Northwest Amazon of Colombia, title that was encoded by law in the 1991 Constitution of the country, and then behind a veil of isolation in the subsequent decade, created by the troubles of modern Colombia, a whole new dream of culture was reborn. Now, the reason that's so significant is that, for example, when I first lived with the people of the Anaconda, the Barasana, the Macuna, the Tanimucos, in the 1970s, it felt like a place where something important had once happened, but not for a long time. The power of the missionaries, the shadow of the rubber era. And we went back to make a film for the National Geographic, and Stephen Hugh Jones, the head of anthropology at Cambridge, flew in halfway through. Now, Stephen, in the late 70s, been part of a BBC strand of films called Disappearing Worlds, where he had sadly predicted the demise of the very people that he and his wife had spent years trying to understand. And Stephen flew in halfway through our project and walked into a longhouse and saw 250 men and women in full ritual regalia taking ayahuasca 3 days and 3 nights in celebration of Cassava Woman. And he just couldn't believe his eyes. And he got out on the satellite phone and he called his wife in London and said, Christina, you won't believe my eyes. The only thing that disappeared were the bloody missionaries. And we then asked the elders why they had allowed the missionaries to do what they had done. And they said, because they promised to make us human. And of course, that's the essence of colonization, to persuade the colonized of their own inherent inferiority. But now that whole culture has been reborn, and just in time, because not only do we now, after 40 years of ethnographic research, realize that this culture is literally the upcountry cousins or the direct descendants of the great civilizations that we now know were in the Amazon at the time of the conquest. In 1541, when Aureliana goes down the Amazon, it's not an empty place, it's home to tens of millions of people. And not only are these societies the upcountry cousins, the direct descendants, we understand now that their mythologies amount to nothing more or less than complex land management plans dictating exactly how people in great numbers can live in the upland forests of the Amazon. All of that could have been lost had it not been for that moment when history turned as if on a fulcrum from the negative to the positive. So people always ask me if I'm optimistic. I always respond by saying pessimism is an indulgent. Despair is an insult to the imagination, just as orthodoxy is the enemy of invention. Why wouldn't you be optimistic? I mean, in my lifetime, since we've seen that vision of the Earth from space, everything's changed. A great wave of illumination has swept over humanity. In my lifetime, women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. Terms like biodiversity weren't even known 40 years ago. Just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was a great victory in the 1960s. Now children respond to the Earth as a living sphere floating in space. And just to get right to the themes of the book, The Wayfinders, that lesson, which will be spoken about 10,000 years from now, that moment, Christmas Eve, 1968, when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon to see for the first time in human history, an Earthrise, there's been another similarly transcendent development in our lifetime, the kind of moonshot of our children's generation. And ironically, that has also come about as a consequence of a long journey facilitated by the brilliance of science, but not into space, but into the very fiber of our beings. And in the last generation, geneticists have finally proven it to be true, something that philosophers always hoped to be true, that we really are brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean, quite literally, studies of the human genome have left no doubt whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race is a total fiction. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. We are all descendants of the same handful of people who walked out of Africa 65,000 years ago, then in 40,000 years carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But here's the important thing. If we're cut from the same cloth, we share the same genius. And how that genius is expressed is simply a matter of choice. There is no hierarchy in the affairs of culture. The old 19th century idea that we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized at the Strand of London has been ridiculed by modern science and shown to be as irrelevant to our lives today as the notion that clergymen had in the 19th century that the earth was but 6,000 years old. And what this means then is that, whether we place our common genius into technological wizardry, or by contrast into the challenge of unraveling the mystic threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice. And what this fundamentally means is that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices of humanity. Every culture's got something to say. Each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine.
The tremendously varied expression of culture is around the world, in many cases, at risk of being lost. And as I think, Wade, you have been quoted as saying, half of the world's languages are not being spoken by children. You're at University of British Columbia. Mark Turin, who I believe is with the Endangered Languages Project, is there. And since language in particular is such a vessel for culture, what can we do? What can anyone do? What directions would you hope that we could head in order to retain, protect some of these languages?
This is a really incredible story. The tragedy after what I just said is that just when we're realizing everybody's got something to say, half the voices of humanity are being silenced. When I first stumbled on this data, it wasn't my research. It was the work of Michael Krauss at University of Fairbanks and Ken Hale at MIT. And I was an anthropologist, but I wasn't aware of that. And the absolute scientific consensus amongst linguists is that of the 7,000 languages spoken when we were born, half aren't being taught to children. And of course, a language isn't just vocabulary, grammar. It's kind of flash to the human spirit. In one of my books, I called it, every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And when I came upon this haunting consensus, my obvious question was, why aren't the linguists screaming about it? And you know what the answer was? The answer is 2 words, Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, as you know, was a darling of the left during our college years. He was also the most insightful linguist of his generation. And he was trying to figure out how what is the nature of language acquisition? And until Chomsky, linguists sort of thought that people acquired language through kind of behavioral reinforcement. You know, Johnny says a word, he gets an apple. And Chomsky quite properly said, that's ridiculous. Language acquisition is very complex. It happens all around the world about the same age. We must be somehow hardwired for that. There must be some kind of universal grammar, a cognitive organ that wasn't a physical organ, but some space in our cognition that facilitated that acquisition, which was the birth of consciousness and what distinguished us from our animal nature. And so the quest of linguists was to find through theoretical analysis the parameters of that universal grammar. And the analogy that Michael Krauss uses comes from DNA. If you want to study the origins of life, you study DNA, and it really doesn't matter if that DNA comes from a fruit fly or from a panda bear, because it's fundamentally the same. And how the phenotypic expression of that DNA makes fruit flies versus pandas, all well and good, but leave that to the conservation biologists and the ecologists. Well, the linguists were saying that the expression of the DNA of language, the universal grammar, was sort of the fluff, and it didn't really matter what these languages were. The key thing is we've got to get to this universal grammar. And it got, because of his reputation, it became a hammerlock on academic linguistic research. And if you wanted to simply go out to the field, learn a language, study its grammar, study its syntax, study compile its dictionaries, you would never get a PhD, right? So if you, in fact, gave me limitless funds to document the 3,500 languages that are imperiled, I could not do it because there are not enough trained linguists to do the job. And Chomsky would not say that languages don't matter, but effectively he did say they didn't matter. And then what happened is suddenly I came along with the bully pulpit of the Geographic right at a time when then there was this kind of movement on Mark Turin's generation, David Crystal, David Harrison, saying, wait, what if the emperor's got no clothes? So in the last decade or 15 years, scores of books have come out, revitalization programs and documentation efforts and so on. And yet it remains to be that half the knowledge of humanity is in fact imperiled. But I think it's really important to remember that change, you know, we have this idea that these cultures, quaint and colorful as they are somehow destined to fade away as if by natural laws, if they're failed attempts to be modern, failed attempts at keeping up. And nothing could be further from the truth. In every case, these are dynamic living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. Technology is no threat to culture. Change is no threat to culture. All cultures are always in a process of change. What is a threat to culture is power. And in every instance, it's either egregious government policies or industrial initiatives or ideology, be it the ubiquitous cult of modernity or the Marxist materialist mania of planned economies. And so if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, the optimistic thing is that we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. And it's not about the traditional versus the modern. It's about the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. It's about finding ways that all peoples on Earth can benefit from the genius of modernity without that engagement demanding the death of their ethnicity. And the reason that's important is not simply human rights or certainly nostalgia. It's because culture is not trivial. Culture is not decorative. Culture is not what we wear and what we sing and what we pray. Culture is a body of ethical and moral values that every society places around each individual to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history tells us lies within all of us. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, to find order in the universe, to do what Lincoln said, seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when the constraints of tradition, morality, ethics, and culture are torn from the individual, you just have to look at human history. And so this is not about nostalgia, it's about cultural survival and geopolitical stability. And again, it's really important to realize that the great curse of humanity is cultural myopia. The idea that my world is the real world and everybody else is a failed attempt at being me. And this goes back through all of our history. You know, when Herodotus traveled 5 centuries before Christ throughout the known world and came back to Athens with these wondrous tales, Plato wanted him to be banned and killed for showing loyalty to the barbarians. The very word barbarian comes from the Greek barbarous, one who babbles. If you didn't speak Greek, you didn't exist. But most Native American names for tribes translates the people. The implication being that the blokes over the savannah are, you know, savages beyond the pale. That's what we have to destroy if we're going to live in a multicultural world of diversity. And the idea is that, you know, it's not looking back, it's really looking forward. And so, for example, we tend to think of ourselves as not being a culture, but the real world rolling forward. Well, yes, if you measure success, as the West always has done, stacking the deck in favor of technological ingenuity, we come out on top. But if you look at our social structure, you could ask some questions. If a Martian anthropologist came to Earth, he, she, or it would see many wonderful things. But if they looked at the States or Canada, they'd say, wait a minute, you guys, you know, you love marriage, but half your marriages end in divorce. You love your grandparents, but only 6% of your homes have grandparents with grandchildren beneath the same roof. You like your families, but you celebrate this slogan 24/7, implying workplace in favor of family, and then you wonder why the average American youth by 18 has spent 3 years watching either video games or television or a monitor, contributing to an obesity epidemic so severe that it's considered a national security issue by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You think you're happy, but you consume 2/3 of the world's antipsychotic drugs while you put 400 million tons of poisons in your rivers every day, and you have an economic system based on arrows and perpetual growth on a finite planet, which is the economics of delusion. You know, climate change, you know, we forget, here's something really important, and I'm sort of, climate change has become humanity's problem. It wasn't caused by humanity. It was caused by a very narrow subset of humanity, which for 400 years has consumed the ancient sunlight of the planet. You know, all around the world, indigenous people are suffering the consequences of a phenomenon that they had no role in creating. And yet, this is where we forget. For us, climate change is either a scientific debate in some quarters, or it's a political challenge, or it's a technological challenge, or a challenge of mitigation. But we forget that most societies live on the planet with a metaphorical set of relationships based on reciprocity, such that the earth owes a bounty to the people, but people therefore owe ritual obligations to the earth. So if something goes wrong, it's the people's fault. And so climate change for indigenous people is a deep existential psychological crisis. And all around the world, we're seeing, from Australia to the Amazon to the high reaches of the Andes and Tibet, individuals trying in their own way, in the terms of reference of their own culture, to do something about climate change when it's beyond their capacity. I lived with a polar Eskimo in Kanak in northwest Greenland. I mean, the ice there used to come in September and stay till July. Now it comes in November and it's gone by March. So their whole world is being undercut.
One example, maybe, Wade, of the importance of family and connection and so on that I've seen, and I think maybe you've spent a little bit of time there, is in Queens, New York. And it's quite interesting, 160 ethnic groups, almost that many languages. A Tibetan friend of mine has made an ethnic map, an atlas of Queens, New York, and what he found quite interesting is that the Himalayan ethnic groups who've settled in Queens have actually settled in a physical geographic pattern east to west that mirrors the east to west settlement in valleys of the Himalayas, quite remarkably. But what really makes that such a vibrant community, I think, is the importance of culture and family. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to how diaspora communities who've reconstituted their cultures, sometimes with modifications, have really been able to maintain tremendous strength, economic vitality, along with some cultural vitality.
I mean, I think we all know this. I mean, you know, I was on Anderson Cooper with Arian Huffington at the end of a year once, and we were supposedly, there was some comedian there that my daughters knew. I didn't know who he was. And it was just this weird panel and to discuss the problems of America. And it got around to immigration, and this was even pre the current administration. And naturally, when it got to immigration, all the bells and whistles, and when you do these shows, you're just a foil for the host's own mania. And all the bells and whistles pop up and everything, and they turn to me, you know, Mexicans, Mexicans across the border, you know, should we build a wall? You know, Dr. Davis, Dr. What should we do? What should we do? And I just took a beat and I said, learn Spanish. You know, I mean, it's really fascinating. You know, what is that we're supposed to not like about Hispanic families? Deep Catholic faith, total fidelity to children, to families, across generations, great food, great dances, incredible music, and also they gave us the gift of our most iconic national symbol, the cowboy. I recently did a book called Cowboys of the Americas, and I decided to really look into this story of the American cowboy. Well, it turns out there is absolutely nothing that has anything to do with anything but Mexico. You know, what actually happened is after the Mexican Revolution, the people, the only really Spanish presence in what became Texas were the Franciscan missionaries who remained loyal to the crown, so they all went back to Spain. And with Mexico as a new nation concerned with what was going on in the heartland, they tried to populate what became Texas with Americans. And so they offered American settlers, if they were farmers, 160 acres in the Jeffersonian formula, but if they were ranchers, they got 4,000. So a lot of people from America discovered the wonder of animal husbandry, but they didn't know how to do it. So they came west and they learned everything. Everything about saddle, cinch, rodeo, ranch, all those words come from Spanish antecedents. And in fact, the cowboy really, cowboys only really existed for about 20 years after the Civil War because the Union armies had eaten all the meat in the North. And if you get feral cattle from Texas to the railhead, you could make a fortune. The cowboys were not what we think them to have been. You know, 35% were black, about 35% were Latino. They were not big and tall. They were tiny as possible because they had to be 14 hours a day in the saddle. They didn't have sidearms. They had lariats. They worked together in teams. They were more like truck drivers on established routes. And what's more, the image we have of the American West about fighting native people as we moved away west was completely made up. Only 400 white settlers got killed by Indians in the 19th century, whereas 30,000 died of exposure alone on the Oregon Trail. By the time the frontier went west, there were no indigenous people left to fight with. The campaign of eradication of the bison had been successful in the first years after the Civil War, and there were no native people really left to attack the wagon trains. No wagon trains ever circled against Indians. They circled to protect their cows. And what happened is that also there were a bunch of writers who, in the wake of the horrors of the Civil War, were looking for a unifying symbol, and they were all inspired by Sir Walter Scott. And of course, Walter Scott had found in Guinevere and Arthur and Lancelot the foundational myth of Britain. And so they created the image of the cowboy. And the cowboy, of course, had to be tall and white and solitary and taciturn. But I mean, John Wayne hated horses. He liked to sail. Ronald Reagan learned to ride on a film set. The Marlboro Man was, of course, a marketing Madison Avenue campaign because they had that brand of cigarettes for women that didn't work, so they tried to reposition it for men, and they invented the Marlboro Man. So, when we really look at the genesis of the iconic symbol of America, the cowboy, we can trace it totally back, including from the style of the clothing, the heels of the boots, everything goes back to Mexico. So why, not to mention the fact that half of our country had been Spanish territory. So why we talk, I don't know why you guys talk about Jamestown when Santa Fe was settled almost a century earlier, not to mention, I might say, Montreal. You know, but I mean, immigration. I mean, you know, we always have to fight against nativism. I mean, it's always been the tool of the scoundrel to whip up fear. I mean, you know, there's no you know, there's no deeper sign of treason or dearth of patriotism than any individual, from be it from the church, be it from the street corner, be it from the White House, who deliberately exploits fear to turn people against each other. And I mean, we're all immigrants on this new world. Even the indigenous people are in effect immigrants. I mean, we all know that this was settled late. I mean, the whole point is we're all wanderers on this planet, going back to the first people who walked out of Africa. So I just don't understand why it is that we turn our backs on those who come to our shores. Canada is quite the opposite. You know, Canada is, you know, I always love it when American politicians say, well, we could never have a Canadian universal health care plan in the States because they can only have it because they're all white. I've actually seen American politics. I mean, in Toronto, our biggest city, over half the people were born outside of Canada. You know, you talk about Queens. In the Scarborough School District, we have 126 languages. In the Toronto General Hospital, you can get treated in about 110 languages. And just no one makes a big deal of it in Canada. It is so automatically accepted. It's a pride of the nation that we're multicultural. And in part, that's because the agony of our history was the fact that we persisted in our stubbornness for almost 300 years to indulge two solitudes that placed Francophone against Anglophone. And in an amazing way, we've come through that. I mean, I've often been asked why I became an anthropologist, and I never really thought about it. I mean, I actually became it because the deadline at Harvard was the next morning, and I had just come out of the Peabody Museum, and I saw this guy, Stuart Sunlam, who was a mate of mine. I said, what are you going to study tomorrow? And he said, anthropology. And I said, what's that? He said, you read about Indians. And I thought, like, Forrest Gump, that'll do. And but when I thought more seriously about it later on, and that's how I entered anthropology. But, you know, when I was a little boy in Quebec, it really was the two solitudes. And I was in an English community that was plunked like a carbuncle into the back of a old Francophone, beautiful village that went back to the 17th century. And my mother would send me to the street corner at the age of 4 and 5 to get cigarettes or milk for the family. And I would sit there and look across that boulevard and think, wow, right across that street there's another language, another religion, another way of being. And why am I not allowed to cross that road? And in a sense, I've been crossing that road ever since. You know.
Great. Thank you, Wade. We're running out of time. We want to make sure that we do have time for questions. Abby is going to, I think, run a mic around, and we have a great opportunity here. Anything at all?
Quick Wade. My name is Lynn Gale, and I'm an Algonquin Anishinaabe from the Ottawa River Valley in Ontario, Canada. That's what they call it anyways, Ontario, Canada. I listened to you talk about power over and the importance of culture, and of course I agree with that. My concern is how you hold up nationalism and how you hold up Canada. So Canada's parliament buildings reside on my land, and they squat there, and they've never given us any money or any funds, and currently the Liberal government, Justin Trudeau, I don't care what he's wrapped in. I really don't care what he's wrapped in, because for me, this is about life and death. This is not about scholarship and knowledge or fame. It's about life and death in my family and all my family. And I'm concerned about the way you hold up Canada and you hold up nationalism, when currently they are forcing us to extinguish our land and not give us land and resources, which is genocide. It is genocide through policy. And that concerns me. And you're a Canadian, and you probably were raised in Anishinaabe territory. And I don't have a question. Sorry.
Well, look, I'm not holding up. I'm not holding up Canada as a nation state as some kind of place without enormous challenges. I think, you know, I can't think of many nation states, perhaps Colombia aside, that have gone through such an effort to come to terms with the past. I mean, we've just gone through an agonizing process of reconciliation. You know, of course, there's enormous challenges, but I find it remarkable that, given the history, the country is quite prepared to engage a treaty process, certainly where I live in British Columbia, that is extraordinarily complex, extremely difficult, will be extremely costly, but is a national exercise in redemption and hope and reconciliation. I'm not saying that things are perfect for First Nations in Canada. Suicide rates, I mean, prison rates, equitable to rates of incarceration of African Americans in the States, rates of suicide 7 times, 8 times that of the non-native community. I mean, there's a million things that have to occur in Canada, but there are also amazing leaders that are indigenous leaders who are working very hard, you know, in engagement with the government. I mean, look, I fight the government all the damn time on environmental issues and other things, but, you know, I'm also very grateful to have been born in Canada. And I'm completely aware of what has happened in our past, and I'm part of a process of trying to reinvent the future. You know, part of the horror of human history. I mean, I ended up in Canada because 1 million of my people were killed by the British. 1/4 of my nation was forced to flee. You know, I am 100% Irish, and I don't use that. I'm not comparing that to what's going on to First Nations today in Canada, but in all human situations, we must overcome and move forward and fight to secure the proper rights and what we have to have. And, you know, that's what I see Canada as being, an ongoing experiment in reconciliation and redemption. I mean, I can't speak to what's going on in your particular piece of land, but that's my point of view.
Other questions?
Sorry. Wade Davis, I really enjoyed your Massey lectures a few years ago. My question is, the world is going towards less liberal world order, less globalism, and much more nationalism, and much more conflict. And what do you see in the future, given the current trends?
You know, the problem of getting these microphones is that you're treated as if you're an oracle or something. I mean, I have no idea. I mean, no, seriously. I mean, the ebb and flow of history is so impossible to predict. I mean, the nativism that we're seeing throughout Europe is obviously a consequence in part of demographics and dislocation in the Middle East, waves of immigrants washing ashore, people taking advantage of that politically to demonize those who are suffering and to exploit their presence for political gain. You know, I don't really, I don't know where we're ending up in that sense. Your guess is as good as mine.
All right, next question.
This is much more simple. Is there a career for linguists and funding for people that want to study linguistics and those that are dying?
Yes, I mean, I've always been sort of an entrepreneur of knowledge, and I've never really thought too much about making a living, and it's always been something I've been able to do. One thing I try to do with my students at university is encourage them to embrace a range of skill sets that will allow them to monetize their considerable knowledge and wisdom. I mean, at a place like University of British Columbia, only about 25% of successful PhDs remain in the academy and become professors. And yet the pedagogy is still sort of focused as if it's the 1950s, and everybody who gets a PhD becomes a professor. And I'm working really hard there to address the needs of the 75%. So in encouraging students to learn how to write well, to speak publicly, to exploit opportunities. I mean, for young people, you know, all young people need to be opportunists. They have to put themselves in the way of opportunities where there's no choice but success. So if you try to plot your way to a career by saying, is there funding, is there an opportunity? Well, there is if you make one for yourself. So I think increasingly, just in terms of linguistics, there's much more funding than there would have been a few years ago. But again, you know, the key thing that academics need to do, in my opinion, is to become storytellers and find ways. I mean, 3 years ago or 4 years ago, Forbes magazine said anthropology was the worst possible undergraduate major if you wanted to get a job, which is kind of silly if you think about it, as if the study of culture and humanity is bad preparation for a corporate career. But in part, it was because anthropology is culpable. I mean, it's been remarkably helpless in terms of advertising itself. I mean, classic stories in the immediate wake of 9/11, the American Anthropological Association met in Washington, D.C. within a month of the crisis, and there were 4,000 anthropologists in town in the immediate wake of the biggest story of culture they'd ever experience or that the country would ever feel. And the entire gathering got one line in the Washington Post in the gossip section that basically said the nutcases are in town again. And you didn't know who was more remiss, the profession for not, well, for the government for not speaking to the one profession that could have answered that question on the lips of most Americans then, why do they hate us? Or even worse, the profession for not reaching out to the public itself with its considerable wisdom and the answers to that question. So, I mean, that's why, you know, I've always tried to think of myself more of a storyteller than as an academic, and encourage my peers to do the same.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Many of us have the privilege and opportunity to travel. How can we travel both more culturally sensitive, but also how can we begin to understand when we're just a visitor? How can we dig a little deeper in these 2-3 week opportunities we have?
Well, there's this sort of conceit in anthropology that anthropologists are different than travelers, and I don't really see much difference between the two. I mean, anthropologists just travel with a different point of view, perhaps. I mean, you know, travel is a complex thing. I mean, it's the biggest engine of the global economy, $3.5 trillion. And obviously more people go in more places than ever before. And I think that can be both obviously negative, but it can also be very positive. I mean, certainly I experienced during the 1970s and 80s that the kind of influx of young European and American travelers throughout the Andean region really turned on a whole generation of Peruvian and Colombian kids and scions of the elite to things they had not really paid attention to, because we weren't really interested in urban Lima, we were interested in rural Altiplano. And so that's been part of this whole rebirth of appreciation of culture, and I think tourism played a role in that. You know, I think you know, it's not difficult to prepare yourself for a journey just by doing some basic reading, and then the main thing is, you know, what is it that makes a cross-cultural moment positive for both visitor and host? Well, it's basically human connection, and it's always the same things that would make you welcome at someone's home at Thanksgiving. You know, if I walked into your house at Thanksgiving and you've been working all day on a turkey and I announce I'm a vegan, it puts a damper on the afternoon. So to me, what is it that allows you to create connection with people with whom you find yourself living as a guest? It's always good manners and kindness and a willingness to eat what's put in front of you and sleep where you're asked to sleep and help out and pick up on the nuances of the rhythms of the culture. And that is a way that you can make connection. And usually what gets in the way of people when they're in that moment is some kind of fear that manifests itself in kind of awkwardness and stubbornness. But spreading goodwill I guess is the only answer.
Okay, we have a question. Oops.
Thank you. Actually, it was a few years ago when I read Wayfinders, and since then this question has been percolating in my mind. So today is a good opportunity to ask you directly. I personally share your enthusiasm about science, about cultural preservation, as well as education. But what is your model world? What will it look like? All cultures, all sciences, all education. And or suppose, let's say, if we could reset the whole world today, and no conflicts, no ideologies, nothing, will we evolve again into a system where people are fighting and killing each other?
I always call those the Jesus questions, I mean, I don't know. I just don't know. Look, I just think that there's certain things we know work better. Pluralism, tolerance, openness, and basic human decency and kindness. That's the world we aspire to, and we'll never achieve that world, but we have to, again, it's this idea of like, if you put your shoulder to the wheel of history, which way are you going to push? And I think that's, and also the other, it may be a cop-out, but storytellers don't pretend to be politicians, and in a way if you go back to that quote from Peter Matthewson, anyone who thinks they can change the world is wrong and dangerous, but we do have an obligation to bear witness to the world, and I think that's what the role of the writer is not to be a polemicist or a politician, but to try to illuminate through the lenses that you have, and in the case of my experience, it's through the lens of ethnography and anthropology and history, to try to sort of just point out these both disturbing and hopeful trends, and then just get out of the way.
Hi. If I may, how did you obtain your racial statistics regarding cowboys?
Oh, that's all out there. It was, it's pretty well accepted. I don't know what the database is for that. But it's generally accepted that about a quarter of the cowboys in the early years were African Americans. And it says the point is not what the specific numbers are. It's just to suggest, especially because this all developed in the immediate wake of the Civil War, that cowboying wasn't exactly an elite occupation. That if African Americans, were a major element of the workforce, and Latinos were as well, that these were just characters doing their job. And the only reason to mention that is, in a sense, to distinguish the reality from the myth that emerges later on, so that you can begin to ask, what is the nature of that myth, what purpose did it serve, and whose interest did that myth serve? So, it's not, when you dig for these statistics, it's more to see what, not to necessarily present them as absolute facts, because who knows, but it's a trend, and what that implies, and what it can tell us, and what it can illuminate about, take something, for example, as the whole history of water issues in the American West. As the frontier moved west, people didn't want to come to terms with the singular geographical fact of North America, which is what Wallace Stegner wrote about, that beyond the 100th meridian, all the way to the Sierra Nevada, north of Mexico, south of Canada, there's no place that gets more than what 10 inches of rain a year. It used to be called the Great American Desert, but deserts imply austerity, and Americans don't do austere. So as the frontier moved west, the ecology by definition stayed the same, but the nomenclature changed, and it all became the painted butte, you know, the Black Hills and so on. And yet the facts remained. And so the imposition on the Western land of the Jeffersonian model of 160 acres per family made no sense. Because if you had water, that might be fine. But if you had no water, you know, and if you had 4,000 acres, it made no sense. But as the frontier moved west, they actually promoted it with all the rigor of 19th century science, that the reason there was no water, no rain west of the meridian was because the land hadn't been turned over. So if the land was turned over, suddenly the rain would come. Well, when that didn't happen, you had to bring the water to the land. And because the Mormons had been so successful in the Salt Lake area, that dream of Zion became the model for greening the American West. And the interesting confluence of Mormon ideology and belief and the quest for Zion with water practices in the American West, that's what led to the reconfiguration of every river you know, west of the Mississippi.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. Let's have a big hand for Wade Davis.